I want to take a moment again to thank everybody for coming to today's courageous conversation, Native and Indigenous leaders leading in local government. We're so glad to have you from wherever you are on the planet, whatever the time is. We really appreciate you being here today. We have two fantastic panelists who will be sharing their experiences with us. We will be welcoming everyone to participate, so you can put questions in the chat. At any point, if you'd like to, you can raise your hand, we can call on you, you can unmute yourself and speak, you can directly message me, so feel free to do so. If you are not speaking, please do remember to keep your microphone muted. That will allow us to have a smooth, comfortable, interruption-free conversation today. We're looking forward to some great information, some great stories, and some great connection. So we'll jump right into it here, and I'm going to share a few words about our panelists today. First, I have Daphne M Hooper, who was appointed Fernley City Manager in 2015 after serving a variety of roles in the city of Fernley as Administrative Services Manager, Interim City Manager, and was promoted to interim assistant city manager within 5 months, where she oversaw human resources, risk management, and water policy. Born and raised in rural Nevada, Emm-Hooper has dedicated most of her career to public service. She co-founded the Nevada Tribal Leadership Development Program through the University of Nevada College of Business. This program was developed specifically for elected and appointed representatives and organizational leaders of Nevada's various tribal councils and tribal communities. Daphne holds a designation as a credentialed manager through ICMA and is completing the public leadership credential through Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. She holds a Master's of Science in Community Economic Development from Southern New Hampshire University, a Master's of Arts in Organizational Management from the University of Phoenix, Reno, and a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from UC Davis. And our other panelist today is Mike Miller, City Manager of Muskogee, Oklahoma. His previous careers include broadcasting, in which he won the Associated Press Award for Best Sportscaster in the state of Florida in 2000, tribal management, having served as General Manager of Marketing for Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and Senior Vice President of Corporate Communications and Government Relations for Cherokee Nation. A native Oklahoman, Miller graduated from Jenks High School, earned his undergraduate degree from Abilene Christian University and his master's from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He has made Muskogee his home for the past 21 years. Mike and his wife Holly have a 16-year-old daughter, Annie, who is a junior at Muskogee High School. Daphne and Mike, welcome to today's conversation.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Thank you. We talked earlier, and I won the coin toss, so Daphne gets to go first.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
All right. Shall I just get started then?
Absolutely, Daphne. I know that you have been at this for a while, so feel free to give us a little bit more background about yourself, including how you came to be in the chair that you currently occupy today.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Daphne Hooper. I am born and raised in Nevada. I am a member of the Walker River Paiute tribe, which is in Schurz, Nevada. And so I'll just give you a little bit of history about who I am. I grew up on a reservation, and my grandfather was actually born on the riverbank in Smith Valley, Nevada, which is a very small community. And he faced many challenges growing up as a native in Nevada. In fact, when he married my grandmother, who is non-native, in the 1950s, it was illegal for them to get married in the state of Nevada. So he had to go to California to get married. And he applied to go to the University of Nevada, Reno, and was declined. There wasn't any Native Americans at that time going to the university. So he went to school in California at Modesto Junior College and was a runner, long distance runner. Then he went to San Jose State. And then he went to Arizona State University and was the first Native to be admitted to their law school. So education is very important to him and to our family. And we were counting degrees the other day, and I think we have 56 degrees in our family of various levels. And it's very important to our family. And so he really encouraged us. And so I am the oldest granddaughter of many, many grandchildren. And so I did go to a junior college and I played softball. And then I went to the University of California at Davis with my intent of going to law school and following in his footsteps. I didn't quite make it there. I came back home. I had a family, and I started in public service. So my first job, I worked with the Reno Sparks Indian Colony as a partnership development specialist, and I learned about public service, and I really enjoyed it. And I had an opportunity to go and work for the city of Reno, which I did. And I learned about local government, which was very intriguing. And I continued on with my education and wanted to really give back to the community. So I did. I went and finished my master's degree, and then I ran a nonprofit, Nevada Urban Indians, working with healthcare for urban natives in the community. And then I had an opportunity to come to the city of Fernley. And I started off as the administrative services manager. And 9 months into my new position, the then city manager left, and I got my break. And so I was asked to serve as the interim city manager, which I did. And I didn't quite feel I was ready to take that role. So they found a new city manager, and a couple of years later, he was gone. And so I had a chance, and I took it, and I've been here ever since. And it's been a great experience, challenging. But I can tell you, especially for those of you who are looking to get into city management, take a chance, right? You got to look for those opportunities and take those risks and build those relationships so you can get that chance to lead your communities. Kind of going back to my family, my great grandparents on my mother's side were native language speakers, and so that was really important. And they were also basket weavers, and so I really learned about our culture.
And also took part in.
And we also, my grandmother was raised in a boarding school. So I don't know if many of you know, but early in the 50s, boarding schools, there was a boarding school in Nevada, and this happened actually throughout the country, but children were taken from their families, from reservations, and placed into boarding schools. And really the government was trying to assimilate the native children to become American. And in those schools, they were beaten and abused and not allowed to speak their native language or practice their culture. And so they were really trying to give them an opportunity to learn English and learn Christianity and become part of the bigger America. And so my grandmother went to a boarding school, and consequently, when she came out, it was shameful to be native. It was shameful to speak your language and practice your culture. And so that generation really experienced a loss of culture, and it was hard for folks after that to be proud of who they are, and it became a little bit shameful. And so we learned growing up that you have to try to make it in two worlds, if you will. We had to be proud of who we are, and my parents always taught me it's important and prideful to be native, but you also have to learn how to live in the bigger world and go on and understand what success looks like. And so I was able to do that. I did that through education. And like I said, I have worked in public service for a long time. When I landed in my job in Fernley, it was a great opportunity because my grandfather actually taught high school here in Fernley, and my father went to the high school here. And so we have a lot of roots in the community, and it's nice to be part of a community where there's a little bit of history and we have good relationships. Fernley is an interesting place when it's the newest incorporated city in the state of Nevada. So in 2001, it became a city, and then there was 7,500 people here. This last census was 23,000. So we've grown tremendously, and we're experiencing a lot of the growth and development with industry and people. So it's an exciting time to be a leader in this community, and we're seeing lots of growth and lots of challenges. I think one thing that's unique about Fernley is we border a reservation. So there's 27 separate reservations in Fernley or in Nevada. So we have lots of relationships with the tribal communities here. We have to work on what those partnerships look like. And I think it's a little bit challenging as a city manager, especially as a Native city manager, because in rural Nevada, it's a very conservative environment, and we're out west. So there's still a lot of, excuse the cliche, cowboys and Indians. And so we have to learn how to balance what that looks like. And there are still some very strong feelings or stereotypes about what Natives are. And so I've sat in boardrooms and conversations about how we deal with the Indians. And it's challenging sometimes as a Native female city manager, but we work through that. And I just try to be honest and open about what people think or what their beliefs are, and try to educate them through that process. But we've been able to build relationships with the tribes. I know a lot of the tribal members in Nevada. It's a very small state. We only have about 3 million people in our entire state. So I know lots of people, and I'm able to work through those relationships. But we have some jurisdictional challenges. We deal a lot with some water issues where we want water and they want water to go to the lake and stay there. And so we have to figure out what that looks like. But I think having those conversations and being open to those conversations is helpful. So we continue to work on what that looks like. As I've gone through my public service career, I really wanted to help our tribal communities. That's where my heart lies. That's where my family is. And so I partnered with the University of Nevada, Reno, and we developed a Nevada Tribal Leadership Development Program. And what that was we created a curriculum that looked at leadership and management, and we opened it up to members of tribal communities with a focus on tribal council to help them develop better government and help them maneuver through the challenges that they face, especially with their sovereignty issues. They are their own nations. They get to create their own laws, but they have to live within the confines of the state and figure out what that looks like.
Thank y'all.
So,
yep. I've already started my next conference. It started at.
So we were, Tammy. So we were able to develop this program and develop leaders. So right before the pandemic hit, we had our first cohort, and we had 25 people participate and complete it. And we went through the program, and they actually got to do some strategic planning and develop some programs that some of them are implementing. So we're waiting to start the second cohort. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit, and so we had to take a bit of a break. A lot of the communities are rural and don't have very good internet access, and so we opted to wait to do it in person. So hopefully next spring we'll be able to start the second cohort. Other issues that we're facing are legislation. So it's a tough balance as a city manager to often wonder which hat to wear and to know when to find the voice that needs to be heard. And so this year in the Nevada State Legislature, they passed a higher education bill, which waived tuition for the Native students of Nevada. So if they're a member of a Nevada tribe, then they can attend the Nevada colleges and universities with tuition waived. So that was really exciting. The other legislation that affected tribal communities this year was there is a town, incidentally, it is the town in which I graduated from high school, but they have it's called a Sundown Town. And so what happened is many years ago, there was a whistle that blew at 5 p.m. And that's when the natives had to leave town, and they were not allowed in town. They had to go back to the reservation. And just until last year, that whistle still blew. And so the Nevada State Legislature was able to change that. And so now the whistle does not blow. So that was a nice win for the Native community. And then the other one is the names that different places have. So there is a place called Squaw Valley. It is in beautiful Lake Tahoe, and many of you might have heard it. The Olympics were there, but the natives worked together and went to the state legislature, and it is now called Palisades. So they were able to change the name to honor the natives who are in that part of the state. So there's a lot to discuss, but I'll go ahead and let Mike go, and then we can continue our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daphne. You see why I let her go first, because she has a lot of good stuff. I'll build on that a little bit just to tell you a little more about myself and my experience, and about how it relates to our Native American community here in Oklahoma. So again, my name is Mike Miller. I grew up here in Oklahoma. When I was in high school, my football coach was the chief of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So Oklahoma is a community bound up with Native American tribes. There's nearly 40 Native American tribes within the state of Oklahoma. And so there's a lot of Native culture here, but it's important to remember that each one of those tribes has its own culture. There is not, you can't speak Indian. There's not an Indian language. You can't. What's the Indian word for blank? That's not a thing. There's a Cherokee word for it, and there's a Creek word for it, and there's a Navajo word for it, but there's not an Indian word for it. So growing up, Native American culture was part of my life. I've been a Cherokee citizen all my life. But as you can tell, I may not look like how you would expect a Native American to look. My daughter very much does look like how you might expect a Native American to look. And so that those dichotomies play out in tribes. I'll tell you a little bit more about my family and then about Muskogee as well. But my family grew deep roots here in Cherokee Nation, and then Indian Territory, then Oklahoma. And when Daphne talked about the boarding schools, that hit home a little bit for me as well, because there's family members of mine that had that same experience. And what I want to pass on to you today is that a lot of the image of tribes is maybe historical, or maybe what we've been exposed to in mass media. What I want you to know today is that my daughter went through what was still is a boarding school. She went there from age 3 through 6th grade. Not as a boarding school student. She got to stay home with her Etchie and her Adode. That's me and my wife, and but she went to Sequoia, which was a boarding school that did all the things Daphne said. They tried to kill the Indian and save the man. That was one of the federally approved government phrases that they would use at these boarding schools. They wanted to turn out non-Indians as soon as they could, and take an Indian and turn them into non-Indians. That is now run, the Sequoia is now run not by the federal government, by the Cherokee Nation in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is about 20 miles from here. And so my daughter was taught Cherokee, and she only spoke Cherokee from age 3 through 6th grade as part of her formal education. And so I think that's an important thing to say as we think about tribes and what they are today and how we relate to them today, is and that there are historical aspects and there's a lot of things that govern how tribes work that may be hundreds of years old. But there's also very real people that live very real lives and have the experience that I'm so happy that Daphne shared about her family. And that I can share somewhat about my family. My family's land here in Muskogee. Growing up, my grandmother had a obelisk, and that's the right word for it. It was about 12 feet tall, made out of steel, and about 5 feet was underground and about 7 feet was straight up. And on that obelisk, it demarked the line between Muskogee Creek Nation and Cherokee Nation. She lived on the border. And Muskogee to this day is a community that is within the reservations of those two tribes. The entire city limits of the town of which I'm city manager is within either the Cherokee Nation or the Muskogee Creek Nation. And so that poses some opportunities and some challenges as well. And so for me and my family, we've known this about Muskogee, and it's been part of our community and part of our experience. To address some of the challenges that we face today, there's a Supreme Court case that was decided just almost 2 years ago now, that radically changed how Indian country is viewed in eastern Oklahoma. It won't necessarily affect any of you, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But the point of me bringing that up is that there are very relevant things happening on a nationwide level that affect how Indian country is viewed in terms of jurisdiction, in terms of taxation, in terms of criminal jurisdiction, in terms of infrastructure funding, and all of those things are tied together. And so right now, there's a potential, depending on how the Supreme Court ruling gets interpreted, is that my city might not be in Oklahoma in the future. It might be a part of Cherokee Nation or Muskogee Creek Nation because of this decision. Our taxing might have to go through those tribal nations rather than through the state of Oklahoma. That's one interpretation of the Supreme Court ruling. So there are challenges and opportunities with that. We have here in Muskogee, I worked for Cherokee Nation, which is my tribal nation, for about a dozen years. I worked directly for the chief. And so I've got a lot of friends in relationships still with the administration there. And I've got good relationships with tribal council members and leaders of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And that helps us work together, because what we have tried to do here in Muskogee, and I've been very thankful to my city council and mayor for taking on this attitude, that we realize that the people that live in Muskogee, they might be Native, they might not be, they might be Creek or Cherokee, or they might be some other tribe if they're Native, but we're all live here in the same area. So what our city council has been great about, and what our tribal partners have been good about, is trying to work together and say, let's not worry about what we call it. Let's not worry about whose name is on it. How can we do better things for the people that live in this area? I don't even say Muskogee, because that's a place, right? We want to do that implies maybe county government or the city government, because we're Muskogee County too. So we don't even say Muskogee. It's like, how can we make things better for people here, or our people, and our people or your people, or live next door? And so those are challenges and opportunities that we face. We're excited about tribal partnerships in Oklahoma. Some cities have taken another view in that they kind of oppose. They see it as and I'm critical of this, so it may come across that way, but they see it as a zero-sum game. So if tribes are doing well, then that means it's not fair to everyone else, or something bad is happening to them because something good is happening to someone else, and they can't be a part of that something else. So it's bad on its face. So there are cities in Oklahoma that are in lawsuits against tribes right now. And that has generally been a formula for losing a lawsuit. There's a lot of well-established federal law that tribes understand very well and municipalities don't. So I don't want to go a lot into the details that are really Oklahoma specific, but I do think that I don't know all the audience, if we're dealing with people that work closely with tribes or are part of tribal nations, if you're a native manager yourself. But there's what I found is that Daphne and I are Zoom friends because we've not ever had a chance to meet. But ICMA hosted a small seminar on at the conference, a video virtual conference, the virtual conference session that I was a part of. And then Daphne reached out to me after that, and we were able to share a lot and discuss similarities and differences and how things work, not just in Nevada with tribes there and Oklahoma and tribes here, but have got to get to know one another. And so this is what I like about this format and this opportunity is the conversation part. And so Daphne and I've talked about quite a few things before about how tribes work with cities, but I don't know when the appropriate time is to start asking what the group wants to hear as well, because there's a lot of ways we can go from here, and so I want to make sure we cover, Tammy, what needs to get covered.
Absolutely, Mike. I have a couple of things I've noted here regarding questions of invisibility, awareness, how to partner with other organizations when you're looking to highlight issues that directly concern Native Americans and Indigenous people, as well as the larger community, as well as Daphne, with your institute. I was curious to know about if that's something that you could readily duplicate in other places, and how, from a practical perspective, other folks who would be looking to do that could do it. But I do have some questions in the chat right now, so I'm going to go ahead and pivot just to start kick that off, and then we can go to those other questions, and then we'll just continue to move forward. A lot of great content, so we appreciate you guys sharing here. So the question I have here is for both of you. What is your view on land acknowledgements without a lot of other consideration given to Native tribes? How do we get past the tokenism of some of those acknowledgements? What might be a next step that's actually meaningful?
Oh.
Wow.
Would you like me to read it again? Or are you pondering a little bit where you want to start with this one?
I think it's nice. The city of Tulsa here in Oklahoma has started doing, or have said they're going to start doing that. I don't know that it's a nice thing, I guess, but it doesn't address anything except an acknowledgement, which is what it says it does. So, Daphne, you may have something.
Land is an interesting question. There's a lot of, and in Nevada, we're facing a lot of issues with regarding to land. Within the city limits in Fernley, we have a piece of property that the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe actually took back into trust, and they built a smoke shop and gas station there. So there is a piece of the reservation within the city limits. The other land issue that's facing us in Nevada is the expansion of the Fallon Naval Airspace Base, which is where Top Gun is located. And they're trying to expand, and the tribes are fighting back because it's going to expand on cultural land. So there's a lot of discussion, and I think it's challenging because you want to acknowledge where tribal communities are and historical places. And I think it becomes a big challenge, especially as communities grow and are developing and figure out what that looks like. And I think it's really important to have meaningful dialogue and discussion about what that means for everybody without just coming in and re-victimizing folks and pushing into areas that maybe we shouldn't. And so I think having the discussion is the first step, and then recognizing and acknowledging that natives are here, because that needs to be the first step.
Well said.
Very important. Yes. Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I do want to just, Daphne said it best, but just briefly, it is an actual thing that is actually happening. That is the Supreme Court fight right now that is affecting, half of Oklahoma right now is about land. And as well, on one hand, the city of Tulsa may read an acknowledgement that this was, city of Tulsa is on Indian land. They also are fighting that issue in court. And so So to the extent there's an opportunity for a community to do more than acknowledge that tribal presence is real and tribal citizens are real and that tribal sovereignty is real today, those are meaningful steps that should be taken.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some practical things? I mean, if one of the things that comes up with conversations around Native Americans and Indigenous folks is there's a certain element of invisibility, right? The original Americans were the Indigenous people, but often in conversations around diversity and inclusion, they're often excluded even from those discussions. And so how do you bring that out? You know, as a city or county manager, how do you begin to elevate their experience? You know, if you're talking about water rights, right? If you're talking about land sovereignty, if you're talking about entire segments of a population that don't have broadband, which affects not only natives, there are people in many rural areas that are non-native. How do you introduce those conversations to people that may not be aware, that sometimes may, because of media and the way historical perceptions are, be somewhat hostile to discussions around those issues and how they impact Indigenous and Native people?
I'll go, I think. I think having the conversation, having those courageous conversations, if you will, I think it's important to be able to acknowledge existence. In Nevada, we've been pretty blessed with, we have a Nevada Indian Commission who really works with the governor to make recognition of existence and establish liaisons with state agencies about who should work with our tribes and remember that they're there and they're a part of our community. And it's not just the neighbor next door. There is an element that needs to be recognized and understood, and having those conversations is important. Nevada's actually done a pretty good job. We have in some of the high schools in Reno, they've started native language programs. And so students can take Spanish or French or Paiute and start speaking. And the university has actually offered Paiute language as well. And I think the Native communities are coming to a place where there's more pride and the ability, I think, to speak out better. We've come through this boarding school generation where there was a lot of loss of culture, and now we're seeing a lot of our elders pass, and we're losing a lot of that culture. And so the younger generations are really stepping up and starting to learn those traditional ways and language, and just being able to recognize and acknowledge those in everyday life, I think is important to have those conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's who's at the table and who you invite to the table. And that's, Daphne and I are in a position where we maybe know people that other city managers may not know that can help. And so when we do economic development here in the city of Muskogee, we look to our tribal partners and say, is this something that you want, that benefits you? Can you help us, or can we help you? So in Oklahoma, in this part of the country, there's not necessarily the issue of being seen or not seen, because there's lots of this is Indian country, for lack of a better term, that a lot of times it's referred to. I do have a couple. It is an interesting experience that my daughter had. I'll tell just two brief stories that are just related to that. One is when she would go visit my in-laws in North Texas and go to church with them, and people would speak Spanish to her. And she was like, and she only spoke Cherokee, and she spoke Cherokee and English, she was like, she did not know what was going on, and she was freaked out because no one thinks that there's Native Americans. No one thinks that she is Native American. No one thinks that she's Cherokee. And a few years later, when she was about 7, we went to New York City, and we went to the Museum of Natural History, or whatever it is. they have this in New York, one of the amazing museums there, and they have a wonderful exhibit on Native Americans. And when you ask about being seen, we don't worry about it here. But my daughter at that young age looked at that exhibit and says, do they know I'm here? She was able to put it in words. Like, do they know that I am a Cherokee? This is a museum exhibit about Cherokees. Do they know that they're still Cherokees? Because it was a historical representation. And so, that identity of, Daphne, you said earlier, our Cherokee is a real tribe, right?
Mhm.
But it was a different thing. But there is in a larger community that sense that or Native Americans, is that still a thing or not a thing?
Mhm.
Right? It's a thing, and so I appreciate your question. I don't know if that's a great way to answer it, but
Absolutely.
I'm sorry if I can just add on to that. I think,
Go ahead, Daphne.
I think that's important. The stereotypical Indian still exists in some people's mind, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we're real people. We don't live in teepees, or we don't live in tule huts or whatever it might be in their local region, and part of the greater community. In addition to having our own tribal communities and practicing Native culture or whatever it might be in those particular areas, I think just like with any group, it's important to be respectful and acknowledge people's existence. One project that we did, we were doing a Main Street beautification program, and we were putting metal banners along Main Street. And because the reservation borders our city, people said, well, we should do something for the natives and include that on there. And I said, okay, but I'm not going to make that decision. It's not my place. And so we had the artist draw some examples, and we took it to the tribal council, and one asked for their support and their permission and to approve what was being drawn and put up. And they agreed, and they appreciated the fact that we took the time to ask. And I don't think you can assume. You have to acknowledge and be respectful and ask permission.
that is fantastic. Not everyone feels honored when you try to honor them. if you're not asking, if they're not involved. That's a great point, Daphne.
Absolutely. So I've got a couple additional questions here. I want to ask not easy, but relative to some of the other questions that are here. This one fairly straightforward, and we kind of discussed this in our pre-meeting for today, Mike, about who is Native and Indigenous, right? Where are they? How is identity established? That was the question we talked about. One of our participants asked the question about whether you've undergone DNA testing that didn't match your genealogy. So we're talking about who qualifies as being Indigenous or Native American. And her question about the DNA testing said that there's not enough testing to validate American Indian lineage. So if you can address those.
I'll go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
This is an interesting question on who's Indian or who's Native or whatever choice of term you choose to use.
Which is another question.
Is another question. I choose to use Native. So I think who's Native and who's not. And I think that varies depending upon which tribe you're talking about. So some tribes have blood quantum requirements. And this is a controversial issue as well, because when you have to show that you're so much Native in order to be a member of a tribe, it becomes challenging. And our communities are small, and they'll start disappearing because of this requirement to show how much Native you are. And I'll give you an example. So in my tribe, you have to be, or in my boys, they're a member of a different tribe, but they have to be a quarter of their tribe to be able to be an enrolled member. Well, their tribe has three different makeups, so Paiute, Shoshone, and Washoe. And their father did not have enough Paiute blood to qualify to be a quarter, which is the requirement. So they used my blood and matched it, and they became a member. Their first cousins are not able to be members because their fathers were not Native, and so they're losing tribal members as a result. What my tribe does is we have descendancy. So if you can show that your family has lineage of being Native, then you can be an enrolled member, and it has to go through an enrollment committee, and you have a little card that shows who you are. But every tribe differs, and the requirements are different. And I think that is an interesting discussion. And Mike, I'm just going to tell your joke. So I think that
oh gosh,
a little light. So, you know, people always say, and I don't want to offend anybody, but so in Indian country, there's always people always say, hey, I'm part Indian. I'm Cherokee because my grandmother was a Cherokee Indian princess. And in Native country, it's kind of a joke because people who say they're Native are always Cherokee. And I know Mike's from a Cherokee nation. But that's a real thing. And growing up, we always thought it was a joke. And I had a friend in high school, and she was from North Carolina and truly part of the Cherokee Nation. And I brought her home, and my mother said, "Who are you?" We always say, "Who you're from? Who's your family?" And she said, "I'm Cherokee." And my mom said, "Is that a real tribe?" Because so many people use that as an example of who they are. And I think that it's challenging because people want to identify ties, and I think that people want to learn their lineage. And I don't think that, I'm sure there's a lot of Native people out there, but in order to be a member of a tribe, you have to prove this. And I think that becomes challenging for folks because people want to understand where they come from. And I think that's a good thing. But just because you're Native doesn't mean you get to be a member of a tribe or get all these benefits, which, by the way, not every Indian gets money or gets benefits or gets free healthcare or gets free housing or gets free education. People make these assumptions about Native people, and it's not true. I think that a lot of the newer tribes or smaller tribes have started creating casinos, and there's this assumption that all tribes have money and all tribes have casinos. And I can tell you that most of the tribes struggle and are dependent upon federal grants to create programs, and economic development is a big issue in Indian country because tribes are trying to learn how to become self-sufficient and economically sustainable for their own communities, because there's still a lot of poverty, there's still a lot of lack of education, there's still a lot of healthcare issues within our tribal communities. And I think it's important to have those discussions and understand them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point. And DNA, the short answer is no, I've not ever had a DNA test. It's not of interest to me. And our tribe has descendancy, just like the United States, right? No matter if your parents are an American citizen and you were born to an American parent, you are now an American citizen. Same with Cherokee Nation. You're a citizen of a government with the Cherokee Nation. You're a citizen of a government with any of the 500 plus tribes in the United States. I will say I am flattered that everyone wants to be Cherokee. I understand it's the best tribe.
Seneca in the house.
They named Jeeps after us. I understand, but it does touch on a point that I want to make real quickly. That wherever you are, if there aren't federally recognized tribes in your area to work with, if you have an opportunity to work with Native organizations, there's a lot of cultural appropriation among Native Americans, and So if someone is wanting to, especially in regard to your city, if they're trying to host a Native American Day, if they're trying to start a Native American commission for your city, if you're trying to do all these things, look very closely. We highly recommend that you look to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is not the Native Americans' favorite organization by any stretch, but they have a list of federally recognized tribes, and there are 3 of them that are Cherokee, but there are dozens, for instance, of Cherokees that call themselves the such and such tribe of Cherokee Indians. That's not a tribe of Indians. It's a 501c3 organization or a club or something like that. So be cautious about who you're working with, because there have been organizations, schools, cities that promote Native Culture Day with charlatan, with a fraud, with people that should not be representing Native culture in any way. And just to be clear, that's just as offensive to Native Americans to have someone dancing around, making up something and calling it, a Native dance or a Native tradition. That's just as offensive as you think it might be. And so be careful as you're trying to be inclusive that there are some safeguards to make sure that, as we talked about, there are real Native Americans that you can work with.
Absolutely. Mike, thank you for that. We have 3 other questions here in the chat. I want to make sure that we get these in the time we have remaining. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes in our time here. Daphne, you were on such a good line earlier, and I didn't want to interrupt when you were talking about the blood quantum conversation. And one of our participants put a question in around that. I just wanted to highlight a little bit from that. So you mentioned blood quantum, and Mike, you talked about ascendancy being a function of whether you're mom or dad, you're part of a nation. So we're not looking so much at the blood quantity. But with the blood quantum conversation, the participant is saying that in the context of social justice, that risks an ultimate elimination of Indigenous peoples, right? And I think you talked a little bit, Daphne, about your son not being able to claim certain tribal affiliation because he didn't have enough, and then he could go with another one. So when you look at this, how does the blood quantum conversation affect the issue of identity and visibility of Indigenous peoples as you discuss it?
I think this is a conversation that many tribes are having across the country, because for so long there was blood quantum requirements. And what that means is, in order to become a member, you have to prove your lineage and your blood quantum. So for example, my grandfather was 4/4 Paiute, and so then my father is 1/2, and you have to build this family tree that shows the blood quantum that can be verified in order to become a member. And consequently, what is happening is because everybody's related, and you lose people to marry, or you marry outside your tribe or to another tribal member or a non-native, your blood quantum is lessened. And so the number of members that tribes are having is decreasing. And so tribes will ultimately go away, right? And so tribes are having these discussions about, do you go to descendancy rolls? What does that look like? And I think it's really hard, even in Native country, even within tribes, you have different mindsets about what should be there or what should not. And so you have, those folks who think that you should be all Native and we shouldn't include anybody else, and other people who think you need to include everybody, and so you have to find that balance, and those discussions are happening. There's a lot of discussion about what that means and requirements and continuation of genocide because you're trying to eliminate tribes. So it is a difficult discussion, but it's something that is a social justice issue, and how do you recognize who you are and what that means for all of our communities.
Yeah, and speaking from a tribe that for a long time has not had a blood quantum as part of our citizenship, the value to it is of having blood quantum is to the extent that that racial and ethnic makeup has a one-to-one relationship with culture, with the Native history. And so a lot of times people may make that just a one-to-one relationship, that like the more Native blood quantum you have, the more you're in touch with the history and culture. And to that degree, it is valuable, because that's what makes the Native culture and the Native nations what they are, is their unique history and the cultural values that each one bring. So you can see some of the idea behind it is, how do we make sure that we stay we? How do we keep our identity as a community within the much larger dominant culture? Right? Like I said, my daughter had no trouble at all learning how to speak English, right? Because there was TV, but we had to make sure she went to a special school so she could speak Cherokee, because that's hard, right? So those kinds of things. And so blood quantum has in the past, I think, been maybe a substitute for that, and it can be seen in some ways as, how do we keep our culture? How do we stay who we are? Mm-hmm. So I understand, like, that maybe the math isn't going to work, but the idea behind it is important.
Exactly. I mean, it's as an African American, we don't have to prove that our great grandmother or have somebody who's closer, like a parent or grandparent, demonstrate that they're Black. The culture is carried on, the language, the ways, all of that, the history. So the blood quantum is in a conversation, but this is really good. I want to get to these last two questions in the 3 minutes we have remaining. And this can go to either one of you, so whichever one wants to jump in. One of the participants writes, our local tribe is working on a controversial casino expansion. Many residents are voicing their feeling opposed to gambling in a negative way towards the local tribe. Any suggestions on dialoguing beyond gambling?
I'll jump in first on this one. I've had a lot of these conversations. It's always best to find the common ground. And what that conversation leads me to believe is there hasn't been any conversations for the last 20 years or 50 years or however long that these communities have been living very close to each other, but not interacting in a meaningful way. If they had, they would have other ways to talk to each other then about, because I really feel like a lot of times in situations like this, the conversation isn't, we don't like gambling. We don't like them gambling. Right? Because, and maybe there's a little not in my backyard, but there's a lot of, in this kind of case, there's a lot of, why can they do it and I can't? Or why can they do it there and we can't? And that's happened a lot in Oklahoma. So what I would say is, think about the conversations that could or should have happened over the last 20 or 30 years about things that you have in common in your community: infrastructure, water, depending on, I mean, every part of the country has different ways that their tribal communities may interact with their local communities. But think, what are those areas of partnerships that we should have been doing a long time ago? And say, all right, if we do this, if this casino happens one way or the other, how can we work together on these other things, right? You can't ignore the elephant in the room, but I would say, if you do this, how will we be able to help you in other ways? I will say this last thing, and I know we're trying to get a lot done in here. When tribes run a casino, and I have helped tribes do that and be very successful doing that, the money goes back into the community. There's not some rich guy making a lot of money. When a tribe has a casino, they are turning around and they're employing their local people. They're building roads, they're doing healthcare, they're doing governmental things that we want done. And they're oftentimes doing it in areas that don't have enough of that already. And so if you look at, that's the other thing I would encourage the local residents to understand, is that money is all going to stay very local. It is going to go and do good in the community. And it might also bring people in from outside to bring the local money in to help do those good things. That was more time than I probably should have given, but that was important to me to go through some of those things.
No, Mike, that's important. We are at 1/2 hour. I did want to do the final question. And just as a reminder to everybody who's here today, the recording of this will be posted on ICMA's channel, so you will be able to access it. If you need to jump off, we understand. But if you want to stay for an additional few minutes so we can get to this last question, and Daphne, if you wanted to piggyback on what Mike said with that prior question, we can do so. So just letting everybody know, we're going to be here for another 5 minutes or so, but the full recording will be available for you to view afterwards.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on what Mike was talking about. I think it's important to have the conversation about why it is the tribe is doing what they're doing. And it's really an economic development opportunity, right? And so whether it's gaming or whether it's warehousing or whatever it is, I think it's important to understand that tribes have to come up with an opportunity for long-term economic development support. And we dealt with an issue. I was working at the city of Reno at the time, and the Reno Sparks Indian Colony wanted to put a Walmart on their property, and they had to put some land into trust. It created some challenges with the freeway. And so I had the fortunate opportunity of working with the city council and the tribal community to be able to figure out what that means moving forward. And so we were able to come up with some resolution. And what that meant was some of the proceeds that came from the sales tax, because that's the tax that then goes to the tribe instead of to the state or to the city. And they put some of those funds back into the local schools. And so there is a way to come up with partnerships that benefit everybody and figure out how to work together. In addition to employment opportunities and everything else. So I think the biggest thing is having that conversation, trying to figure out what everybody's trying to accomplish and how you can come to terms together.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Daphne. And with about 3 minutes to go, I have one final question to pose to both of you. And Daphne, you may want to answer this one first, but Mike, if you're feeling particularly excited about this one, feel free. And the question is, in developing leadership programs for the Native American tribal councils, do you see widely disparate needs between the tribes?
So I'll go just because we developed our leadership program.
Right. It's your question. I mean, I'm ready to buzz in, but it's
so close, Mike, so close.
I think that the needs of the community are in all of the communities. And it's not unlike any other communities, right? I mean, there's a need for developing leadership skills. There's a need to understand policy development. There's a need to have discussions around education and social needs. But I think that, having a tribal leadership program kind of brings everybody together, just like we do at ICMA, right? We come together, we share our experiences, we understand that everybody has the same issues, and then figure out tools and resources to support each other to address those issues in the long run.
I agree. The only thing I would add is that the ICMA has the advantage of we're all generally working from the council manager form of government, and tribes. Each tribe has the ability to craft their own constitution and their own form of government. And so it's a great question, because it's one I want to ask Daphne as well, or maybe we could talk later, is how do you overcome those challenges? Because a lot of tribes have a more corporate model and some have more of a United States model, and some have legislatures and some don't. And so there's that kind of differential about how the actual government works. But your answer was great as far as the leadership skills and issues facing Native American nations is very similar. So
I think, and just to answer that a little bit, I think the model that we use really kind of pairs groups together. So we kind of go through these learning tools and talk about general topics, and then they get an opportunity to develop these programs and look at, from a strategic planning standpoint, how they would come up with a particular project or program that fits their community. And so in that respect, they're able to address how they're built.
Wow. And we are just 5 minutes after tremendous content. Daphne, Mike, Want to thank you for being here today, for sharing your stories, your personal experiences, your professional experiences, and your insight. A lot of rich content here. There are a lot of comments in the chat. The participants have been extremely appreciative. I will share that with you. Again, this recording will be made available for everybody to see within the next few days in ICMA's channels. So we want to thank you for being here today, for your time, for your attention, for your interest and your engagement. And we wish you a most wonderful week. Thank you.
Thank you.